Hello everyone, this is lecture 3 for lifespan development in social work. Today what we're going to talk about is growth and change, the ideas of how the body, what do we mean first by growth, and that growth occurs particularly in the first third of life, and that change occurs throughout the entire life. And I'll get into that, what I mean by that, in a moment. What we'll do is look at various different biosocial developmental highlights. So the overall growth or changes that are typical for different parts or systems of the body. So let's start off with the infant. We've already talked about prenatal development, growth, etc. But now we have a baby out in the world, and what we realize about the newborn, and especially for the first few years of life, is that we have what is called the top-heavy infant. And the reason why this is called the top-heavy infant is because 25% of the body of an infant is their heads. For adults, the head is only 11% of the body. This demonstrates how important neural and brain development is during this period. And I don't know if you remember us talking about this last week, but that the one system in the body during prenatal care, or I should say prenatal development, that is always vulnerable, is always developing, is the central nervous system. And that continues to be the case post-birth as well. Although everything is needed, everything is there that is needed for the brain to develop, more development still occurs after the first few years of life. Newborns and toddlers have lots of extra neurons than what are actually needed. Maturation, that is the increased density, complexity, and connective networks in the brain, continue to occur post-birth through the first few years of life in particular. It continues throughout, actually into adolescence, but much of this maturation of increased density, complexity, and connectivity occurs during the first few years of life. The frontal cortex assists with self-control and regulation, and this begins to develop. But however, this frontal cortex is poorly developed in the newborn. This becomes increasingly more developed throughout the first year of life, so that infants at this age can better regulate their reflexes and reactions to their environment. And if you ever watched a one-year-old, a newborn to one-year-old, you see this incredible amount of change in their ability to manage their extremities, their reflexes, their interaction with the environment. That is because the frontal cortex is rapidly developing during that first year of life. Now, cultural attitudes and customs can influence the patterns of development in this early part of life. This is particularly true with wakefulness and sleep patterns, so that in some countries, children, or infants I should say, may only be able to sleep at certain amounts of time, maybe several hours during a night, for example, whereas other children are able to sleep for longer periods of time. And this is due to cultural differences. So, for example, in the West, infants are often placed in separate rooms by themselves in a crib in a darkened environment that is very quiet. In other cultures, infants are literally attached to a caregiver, typically the mother, in some kind of maybe the mother is carrying the infant around with her while she's working, and the infant can literally fall asleep at any point during the day. So there may be brightness, sunshine, there may be lots of people around, a lot of jostling, a lot of noise, and yet the infant is still able to sleep. So these cultural differences can actually influence brain development around sleepfulness and what kind of sleep patterns infants can have. Now, gross motor activities. Gross motor skills or activities are these broad, whole body skills such as walking or crawling. And we'll talk about this over the rest of the semester, particularly in the first part of the semester. Fine motor skills involve more specific or finer bodily skills such as grasping, holding an object, eventually writing. By 8 to 10 months, most infants crawl on all fours, so they start showing this gross motor skills with crawling. Walking usually begins with some assistance around 9 months. By 10 months, many infants are able to stand alone for very short periods of time. By 12 months, an infant can start taking its first steps. So just in a matter of 3 months, we start seeing this rapid development. Once a baby can walk, that child is then referred to as a toddler. Newborns' 5 senses are also functioning, but at a very basic level, except for hearing. Hearing is the most developed and acute sense of the 5 senses, at least at birth. By 1 month, for example, an infant can recognize their main caregiver's voice when compared to other human voices. Vision. Babies' vision tends to be cloudy, nonspecific. Nonetheless, particularly newborns, but we also know that in the first year of life, babies prefer visual stimulation. They prefer novel versus familiar images, complex and active patterns versus simple and static images, contrasts and contours, visual events that represent incongruity and discrepancy. Anything that's novel, new, and visually stimulating to watch. If you are not familiar with the Teletubbies, which was a program aimed at infants and toddlers, you might want to check into that because they clearly knew their audience with the kind of visual stimulation that they use during the production of each episode. Okay, brain development in early childhood. Between the ages of 2 to 6 years old, children on average grow an estimated of 3 inches and gain about 4.5 pounds. The brain develops faster than any other part of the body during this period of change. This is particularly true from infancy through toddlerhood into preschool years. 90% of the brain is pretty much developed by age 5, 100% of the brain by age 7, although connectivity, specificity, and further maturation continues throughout the child's life up until through adolescence, I should say. Now the corpus callosum, which is that bridge right in the middle of that brain image that you see in front of you, that is the area that connects the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. These nerve connections between these two hemispheres develop at a rapid rate starting at around the age of 5. And it's because of this rapid nerve development between the right and the left hemispheres of the brain that the child is able to develop even finer gross motor as well as fine motor skills. Other areas of the brain that develop include those that regulate bodily control, coordination, emotions. We'll get into that more later in the semester. Thinking and cognitive processes. Again, we will get into that more in the semester. Visual scanning, eye-hand coordination really begins to develop and become more refined during this period of time. Now the growth has different growth spurts. Although the brain is growing rapidly, certain parts of the brain may be growing more rapidly than other parts during this period of time. So there are growth spurts. So for example, the left hemisphere has a growth spurt, I should say, between the ages of 4 and 5. This involves language abilities and shape and pattern recognition. The right hemisphere has another period of time of growth spurt, I should say, which deals with visual acuity and the onset of language, speech, I should say. Now, during this 2 to 5 years of life, gross motor skills dramatically improve. Although practice is important, much of this is purely due to further brain maturation. That's amazing if you think about it, that it is the development that you see in 3 to 5-year-olds in their gross motor skills, much of that has to do with the fact that you are watching the brain further develop and mature for that individual. Fine motor skills are a bit of a different story. Preschoolers find such tasks much more difficult due to an incomplete myelination of the central nervous system, insufficient muscular control, and just a lack of patience. This again gets into frontal cortex development that has not developed enough for the child to be able to have a level of patience with themselves in developing or practicing, let's say, the kinds of things that fine motor skills often require for us. Now, growth is determined primarily by 3 factors for individuals: genetic background, health care, the kind of health care that the child had during the pregnancy, as well as after the pregnancy, as well as nutrition. So these 3 have very important impacts on the kind of development that occurs for individuals from gestation and pregnancy through the pregnancy up to about the age of 5 or 6. The main problem for children in the U.S. is nutrition. And it's not that we don't get enough calories, that children don't get enough calories, which was the case 100 to 150 years ago. It was malnutrition in the United States. Children did not get enough calories during these very critical periods of growth. It's that children eat too few fruits and vegetables and eat way too much sugar and fat, as we can see by our little friend here with the sucker. Other things that are important during this period of time: boys tend to be more muscular and have less body fat and are slightly taller than girls. Preschool children's appetite also tend to be smaller than those of infants and toddlers. So you'll see this kind of voracious appetite for infants and toddlers, but then there's this kind of waning of the appetite during the preschool years. Also, with preschoolers is they tend to insist on special routines and eating only certain foods. This is normal for children, that they eat less during the preschool years. This is about the age of, around age 3 up through about probably 5 or 6 years of age. Case in point, when I was 4 and 5 years old, I absolutely insisted that the only thing I could eat were 2 things: peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and toasted cheese sandwiches. I don't know how many times my parents would take me to a lovely, elegant restaurant. My father would look at me and say, "Would you like a steak? Would you like this? Would you like that?" And I would look at the maître d' and say, "Can I please have a toasted cheese sandwich?" I can't tell you how many toasted cheese sandwiches I ate between the ages of 4 and 6. Okay. Alrighty. Having said all that, there are risk factors for young children. At one time, risk factors for children, particularly in the West, and again I'm talking about the United States, primarily were infections and illnesses. And there was a time where anywhere between a fourth to maybe a half of the pregnancies or the lives of young children ended by the age of 5. So women would either lose a pregnancy or a child would not survive beyond the age of 5 years old due to infections and diseases. Much of that through public health and through advances in medical care have obviously changed that pattern in the United States. Nonetheless, for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, the leading cause of death are accidents. This is impacted by 3 things. Gender. Boys tend to suffer more injuries and accidental deaths, 1/3 more than girls. Neighborhoods and the physical environment. Crowded urban areas or rural areas increase risk for accidents. And poverty. Because poor children live in homes where there are more hazards, impoverishment involves increased risk in accidents that can lead to serious injuries or death. So let's now move on to older children, or the school years. We're looking now at children between the ages of from 7 to 11 years old. Really, the biggest changes that occur for older children is what they call size and shape. Children's rate of physical growth actually slows down during this period. It's kind of a latency period of physical growth. And this is also the period that corresponds with Freud's own hypothesized latency period between the psychosexual phases of the phallic and genital stages. Generally, children grow taller, slimmer, and stronger. Because of high nutrition rates, differences across children in more industrialized countries are more due to heredity rather than due to malnutrition. So when we look at this lineup of kids, this is a great picture of these kids. As you can see, they're taller and they're slimmer, and they're probably stronger than they were just 2 or 3 years ago. So when we look at these kids, we realize that the differences that we see in them, or in their abilities that we're obviously not able to see just from this picture, is probably due to heredity. Skill development is also an important feature during this time. Because of the slowing down of overall growth, this is a period of improving upon the skills that were already developed during early childhood. So we see that skill acquisition involves a combination of the following: continued physical maturation, including brain maturation, innate abilities, as well as practice and social modeling. It is during this period of time that we see that children do gain the ability to be patient with themselves in gaining more refined motor skills. Now, there are some gender differences in skill levels, but these are nearly nil. This is the period of life where we see the fewest differences in skills between boys and girls. There's also increased growth in the corpus callosum. That's a child's ability to coordinate various different tasks, and skills improve due to this improved connectivity between the left and right hemispheres. So, adolescence. Adolescence is approximately starting at about, depending on the individual, 8, 9 years old, and can last up to, again, depending on the individual, 19 to 20 years of age. Puberty begins when hormones from the hypothalamus are released, and this hypothalamus is at the base of the brain. The hypothalamus excretes these hormones. These stimulate other hormones from the adrenal glands, which are the small glands near the kidneys. This in turn stimulates other hormone production from the gonads, or the sex glands, which then excrete testosterone and estrogen. And it's the excretion of testosterone and estrogen that begins this process of sexual maturation during puberty. Again, as I said before, age of onset is variable. Typically, it begins between the ages of 18 and 14 years of age. Girls typically start puberty about a year on average before boys. Sex, genetic inheritance, nutrition, availability of health care and health insurance, and emotional stability of home all contribute to the onset of puberty. So, for example, onset is secondary to ethnic background, such as African American youth start puberty the earliest, while Asian American youth typically start later than any other group. This suggests heritability and genetic influences. Another example, longitudinal research shows that children that live in homes with greater family conflict and enduring stress, especially due to poverty, on average, these children begin the onset of puberty earlier than other children. Another example, stockier individuals begin puberty sooner on average than those who are taller and thinner. That is because weight is one of the signals, if you will, to the adrenal glands and to the hypothalamus to start this process. Once the body reaches a certain weight, it hits a tipping point and the puberty process begins. Now, an important point about puberty is that both testosterone and estrogen are produced in all children. Testosterone is not just for boys and estrogen is not just for girls. Okay, that's a misconception. However, generally, boys have more testosterone and girls have more estrogen produced during puberty, but both have both. Let's put it that way. Rapid increase of testosterone, by the way, is partly responsible for more rapid emotional changes seen in adolescence. Estrogen has little to do with that. Also, hormones play a minimal and indirect role in mood swings seen in adolescence. So although we may see more mood swings due to hormonal changes, the hormonal aspect or piece of it is by far the minimal aspect of it. Typically, social circumstances play a far greater part in mood swings for adolescents than hormones, as well as personality. And we'll get into personality as well as social circumstances later in the semester. Children who experience puberty at the same approximate time as their peers tend to view the experience in less negative terms. That is, children who start sooner than their peers or start later than their peers tend to experience puberty much more negatively than those who experience it, so to speak, on time or on average to their peers. By the way, I might add that girls are more likely to start puberty. If an individual does start puberty sooner, typically it's a girl. And if it's an individual who starts puberty later than on average, it's typically a boy, although that's not always 100% true. Now, again, puberty deals with the onset of sexual characteristics. There are primary and secondary sexual characteristics. And it's important to note the difference, because once primary sex characteristics are complete, then the possibility of reproduction is present regardless of what stage secondary sex characteristics are at. Primary sex characteristics refer to those parts of the body that are directly involved with reproduction, such as the vagina, the uterus, ovaries, testicles, and penis. Secondary sex characteristics are demonstrated in more overt bodily changes, such as body shape, change in voice, increase in body hair that signify sexual maturation, but are not directly involved with reproduction or the ability to reproduce. So it is possible, for example, to have a 9-year-old girl who has minimal to no secondary sexual characteristics, but has all her primary sexual characteristics in place to become pregnant. Most people assume that an individual has to look like the example we have on the slide here. This person obviously is an adolescent who is exhibiting secondary sexual characteristics. But her primary sexual characteristics were probably in place far sooner than any secondary sexual characteristics. Girls begin puberty, again, about a year earlier than boys. On average, though, I know I said 8 to 14 was the range, but on average, girls nowadays start between the ages of 11 and 12. Boys start around the ages of 13 and 14. By the way, 100 years ago, the average age for girls to start puberty was about 13, 14, or 15. Which is really amazing if you think about it. Much of that, it is hypothesized that much of that difference is due to better nutrition. So girls, 100 years ago, there were more girls who were malnourished. Therefore, they stayed thinner and smaller for longer periods of time, and it took them longer to reach that. Remember that weight tipping point that was a signal to the hypothalamus to start the puberty process. Okay. So again, there's wide variability about these onset of puberty. There's also wide variation regarding menstruation and the onset of menstruation for girls. It differs in fact, the onset of menstruation varies in different parts of the world, and even with different affluence levels. So, more affluent, better nourished, healthier girls start menstruation earlier. Obesity, which results in an increase in the section of leptin, a hormone associated with the onset of menstruation, leads to earlier puberty and therefore earlier menstruation. Some studies show that the proportion of fat to muscle in the body plays a part in the timing of menarche, of menstruation, of the onset of it, as well as the onset of puberty, as I said earlier. Environmental stress can bring about early menstruation, again, because of the earlier onset of puberty. The age of menstruation or onset of menstruation in the U.S. has declined since the 19th century, which I just talked about earlier. Menstruation is one of several of the primary sex characteristics, which involve organs and structures of the body related to reproduction. I'm repeating myself to make sure that you hear that one more time. And remember that secondary sex characteristics involve the visible signs of sexual maturation that do not involve directly with reproduction. Okay. See? For boys' sexual maturation, that follows a slightly different course. The growth of the penis and the scrotum accelerates around the age of 12 on average, reaching adult sizes about 3 or 4 years later. The boy's first ejaculate usually occurs around the age of 13, although the body has been producing sperm for about a year at that point. Other primary and secondary changes in boys also occur at this time. What that means is that the process of puberty tends to take a little bit longer than for girls. Girls, once it starts, it moves a little bit faster and a little bit more in a specific trajectory, if you will, than what is typically seen for boys. Another important issue for adolescents is body image. And this is the mental conceptualization that someone has about his or her body. Issues of body image typically begin in adolescence and can continue well into adulthood, even into older adulthood. In fact, body image tends to be most prominent an issue for adolescents and for older adults. Why? Well, for example, girls who mature earlier tend to have more difficulties with teasing and having the assumption that they are sexually active sooner than their peers. Also, girls tend to have older males interested in them sooner and may be pressured into sexual activity before they feel comfortable or ready to do so. Why is body image important? Because boys who are shorter, who are less athletic, who are viewed as physically weak or less attractive by their peers, and who become sexually active at a later stage tend to have more difficulties in puberty regardless of the onset of puberty. Also, the body rapidly changes in puberty, and growth occurs from the extremities, that is the limbs, and then inward into the trunk of the body. Thus, people can appear gawky or clumsy. Also, girls more than boys gain more body fat, typically of mature adult women. Also, during adolescence, how others respond to these obvious changes in adolescence can cause embarrassment or self-consciousness. And then, of course, because of societal norms regarding beauty. Media norms include men who are tall, athletic, and muscular are considered attractive, and women who are thin, young, and shapely are considered attractive. So these are the norms, which, by the way, most people can't meet for various different reasons. Also, in the West, there is the norm that men and women should have facial features that suggest an Anglo ancestry or some similarity thereof. So we see, for example, that certain models, even if they are African American or Latino, may have more Anglo features, that is, more white-like features. And those kinds of features are considered more attractive in the United States. By the way, across racial groups. These are norms that have been, this is research that has been done across different ethnic communities, and it's pretty consistent what each of these ethnic communities believe is, what characteristics are believed to be attractive for males and females. And that is what I just reported to you. Okay. Now, let's move into young adulthood. Young adulthood is approximately from about the age of 20 to about the age of 40. Believe it or not, it's been extended. When I was a young lad during the 1960s, a kid, anyone over 30 was considered suspect because, you know, once you hit 30 and older, you were middle-aged. But because of the growing length of lifespan here in the United States, people are living longer and longer. Young adulthood has been expanded to not only beyond 30, not only beyond 35, which that was the age cutoff maybe 15 years ago. Now they're upping it up to about 40. So young adulthood is approximately between the ages of 20 and 40 years of age, and it's the physical period of the prime of life. And what I mean by that is this is the time of life when people are typically their healthiest and their strongest. If there are declines in health, it is typically due to lifestyle choices and not due to normal aging processes. If there are difficulties in health during this period of time, it is typically a genetic cause that is involved or due to some kind of physical trauma. That it means that for both sexes, physical strength and physical health typically are at their peak Although, due to greater muscle mass, men do tend on average to be stronger than women. Because all body systems are at their peak, visits to the doctor are less than half of those who are middle or older aged. And in fact, it's during this age period that many adults actually forego having health insurance because they figure they don't need health insurance since they don't go to the doctor very often, and even when they get sick, they recover fairly rapidly. But there is a little bit of a catch to young adulthood, and that is young adulthood is the onset of aging. We call this process senescence. Senescence starts when overall growth stops. Once physical maturation ends, a process of gradual physical decline begins. And this is the beginning of the aging process. And this aging process continues throughout the rest of life. Our bodies do not go into a period of stasis. What I mean by that is, once growth ends, then aging begins. Okay? It's not like growth ends, then we're kind of stable for a while, and then aging begins. Aging actually begins once growth ends. Now, the rate of senescence, that is, how quickly and how intensely people experience the aging process, is highly varied across individuals, across different organs and systems in the body, and across periods of life. Young adulthood typically is the period of adulthood when senescence occurs very slowly. In fact, it is so slow that most people do not notice it at all. Probably the first glimpse of it occurring, or a glimpse that a younger adult is noticing that they are getting older, is when they go out, they party with their friends till late hours in the night, then they get up the next morning and they feel horrible. And they think, what have I done? I can't do that anymore. That's because the aging process has started for that individual. Okay? Now, all of this whole rate of senescence based on individuals, the organs or systems of the body, the period of life, all of these are influenced by several things. Genetics, of course, sex, cultural context and norms, health care and public policy, environment, and personal lifestyle choices. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Genetics and sex, we'll talk about sex a little bit later in this lecture. I want to be really clear about healthcare and public policy. That really comes into play around health insurance, around levels of poverty. We know that when people do not have ongoing health insurance, we know when people have long periods of impoverishment, that the aging process, this senescence, occurs more rapidly for individuals. Okay? Okay. Middle adulthood. As you can see, I've just talked about senescence. Growth stops and gradual physical decline related to aging begins. This starts in young adulthood and continues on from there. What happens with middle adulthood is that the rate of senescence begins to increase, and it begins to intensify. Again, this is all related and dependent on the specific individual, which organs or system of the body we're talking about. The period of life is middle adulthood, so now we're starting to see a greater rate or a more rapid rate of senescence. All of this, again, is based on the genetics of the individual, the sex of the individual, the cultural context, the economic context, the personal lifestyle choices of the individual, etc. Now, a concept I want to include here is the idea of two concepts. One, you see reserve capacity, but I also want to mention homeostasis, which you'll remember gets into social systems theory, but this is around physical homeostasis. This is the physiological process in which the body functions to maintain or resume a state of balance and equilibrium. As people age, their ability to achieve homeostasis after physical exertion diminishes. Thus, it is harder for older adults to recover from physical exertion than it is for younger adults. So, for example, if we took a 25-year-old and we took a 45-year-old and we had them run a mile, it would take less time for the 25-year-old to regain their homeostasis than it would be for the 45-year-old. Now, the 45-year-old would eventually regain homeostasis too, but at a slower rate. That is because of reserve capacity. This is the extra capacity of each organ to respond to prolonged periods of physical exertion and/or emotional stress. With age, this so-called organ reserves decreases. However, due to lifestyle and a relative calm in industrial countries, reserve capacity, the decline in reserve capacity between younger and middle-aged adults is almost unnoticeable until around the age of 70. That is, our lives are so sedentary that now in modern life, for the vast majority of us, because the majority of us do not engage in ongoing physical activity, except for perhaps farmers or for certain people in certain working class professions, artisans, however, may be much more physically active during the day. Those individuals probably notice the decline in their reserve capacity much sooner than those of us who have a more sedentary lifestyle. Because, well, when you sit around all day, you're not pushing yourself, you're not pushing against the homeostasis, and therefore needing to tap into your reserve capacity because you're not physically straining yourself during the day. So, as we can see, reserve capacity, not only does it take longer for us as we get older in middle adulthood to return to our homeostasis, but we have less reserve capacity in our physical body. That's why it takes us longer when we are middle-aged to reach homeostasis. It is during midlife that we see some of the following. Hair is drier, grayer, and thinner. Skin dries and loses its elasticity. Wrinkles. Fat begins to collect more around the center of the body. Muscle tone softens and sags. There are some differences around this as well. The senses, particularly hearing and vision, begin to diminish. Hearing particularly impacts males as opposed to females. That is, the diminishment of hearing occurs. Also, where fat collects around the body is slightly different for men and women. For men, it tends to be around the center, upper part of the body and center of the torso. For women, it tends to be around the stomach and around the hips. Believe it or not, it's preferable that the weight be around the stomach and the hips than around the heart and the chest. This may be the reason why men tend to have more problems with heart disease, because of the strain of additional weight around the chest and the center of the body. Okay, moving right along. Older adulthood. Older adulthood, Middle adulthood, I forgot to tell you that middle adulthood starts around the age of 40 and goes to about the age of 65, 70. Notice I'm giving you two different numbers because there's now conversations about really when does older adulthood begin, when does middle adulthood end, etc. But for our purposes, let's say 40 to 65 is middle adulthood. Older adulthood is about 65, of course, until death. Gerontology is the scientific study of the aging process in older adulthood that includes biological, psychological, and social changes. Now, one thing I want to remind you of that we talked about briefly at the beginning of the lecture, and that is this is about growth and development and change. Growth occurs from infancy to the end of adolescence. Change occurs from infancy through adolescence. But change also continues throughout the rest of the life course. And so when we're talking about development, although it's an aging process, changes do occur across the life cycle. Let's see. One thing I want to mention before we move on is that the fastest growing segment of the population in wealthier countries, proportion-wise, not in real numbers, but proportion-wise, are those in their 80s. Now, in gerontology, they like to differentiate, they like to create subsets about older adults. And we have what we call the young and old, the old, and the oldest old. Do you like that? So the young old are recent retirees. They tend to be healthier and have more vigorous lifestyles. We have an example to your left. This is around the age of 65 to 75. The old, the onset of more chronic and disabling health problems occur in this age period. Physical activity becomes more limited. This is between the ages of 75 and 85. And then we have the oldest old, or the elderly. Chronic health problems become prominently disabling. The person becomes increasingly more dependent on others and vulnerable to an increasing array of physical problems. And these are people 85 years and older. The reason why they've done this with older adulthood is that you can see that between somebody who is 65 and let's say 90, you see dramatic differences between those individuals. That's because the aging process begins to ramp up and increase in intensity and rapidity across older adulthood. It's almost the reverse of what we see with growth. Growth is very rapid and intense at the first few years of life, and then as we get into adolescence, it begins to slow down somewhat. Well, the reverse is true with older adulthood. The aging process begins to ramp up, begins to increase, and then as we go from just in a matter of 5 to 10 years, we see that the aging process is intensifying and increasing more and more for individuals. That's why there's this differentiation, these kind of subsets, I should say, for older adulthood. There are what are called primary and secondary aging processes. The primary aging process is senescence, what we've already talked about. So this is the universal and irreversible physical changes that occur over time to all species, not just to humans. Recall that senescence begins in early adulthood, and with advanced age, the process intensifies and speeds up. Adjustment to these changes secondary to senescence is a balance between keeping optimally active while adjusting for diminishing abilities and a slowing down and a diminishment of reserve capacity, as we've talked about. Secondary aging is that aspect of aging that is influenced by other factors other than the usual universal aging process of senescence. These factors that can contribute to secondary aging process that is increasing the aging process is genetics. The social support that people feel that they have. People who are more isolated tend to age faster than those who are less isolated. Sense of personal control and quality of life. Personality profile, and we'll get into personality types later on in the semester. Socioeconomic status. Again, we talked about this earlier, that poverty does increase the aging process. There are also lifestyle choices, but we'll get into those. Oh, did I miss that here? Let me just make sure I didn't miss that. No. The lifestyle choices primarily deal with, as we can see with our older gentleman here, smoking, alcohol intake, activity level. Even if a person is thin, let's say, or an optimal weight, but is not physically active, that will slow down, that will speed up the aging process for them. And weight gain, especially obesity. There is some research to show that having some extra weight, being slightly overweight, is not problematic for older adults. It's when we move into obesity that it becomes a problem for older adults. And that also can speed up the aging process. Alrighty, this is our second piece. Now we went through this whole broad sweep of development across the life cycle from birth to death. But what about the senses? Let's take this as a specific topic of change. It's an example of growth and change across the life cycle, and that is sensation and perception. Sensation is the stimulation of the sense organs. Perception is the sorting out, interpretation, analysis, and integration of stimuli involving the sense organs and brain. What are the sense organs? Go back to the previous slide and you'll see what I'm talking about. Eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin. Okay? Now, lots of people think that infants don't have few to no senses, especially I should say newborns, not infants. Newborns have few to no senses at all. In fact, at one time, people believed that children were born blind, couldn't see at all, that the eyes were not fully developed at birth. We now know that that's not the case. All five senses are present and working in infancy. Newborn infants cannot see beyond 20 feet, but by 6 months, the average infant's vision is already 20/20. Binocular vision is the ability to combine both the eye's vision to see depth and motion, and this is achieved by 14 weeks. It's amazing. Research has shown that infants prefer to look at patterns and complex stimuli, which I've already talked about. And this is an interesting thing that I forgot to mention. Infants prefer to look at faces over other objects. Auditory perception. The ability to hear begins prenatally, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that at the last lecture, but prenatal the fetus can hear. And of course, as I said earlier, the sense of hearing is the most developed at birth. Infants are more sensitive than adults to high and low frequencies, but not to middle ranges. Those ability to hear middle ranges develop later throughout the first year of life. Sound localization permits an infant to discern the direction from which a sound is emanating. Now, this skill is poor in infants, I should say, than adults, but it reaches an adult level by, guess what? By 1 year. Notice how rapidly development occurs just in senses and perception. We're just talking about that part of the body. And then infants can differentiate changes in sound, which is a requirement for language, by the way, and it recognizes its caretaker's voice, as I said earlier, compared to other voices. Smell and taste. Infants react to unpleasant taste and smells right from birth. Newborns can detect their mother's smell, but only when breastfed. That's interesting. Infants have an innate sweet tooth. Well, I could have told you that one. Sensitivity to pain and touch. Infants are born with the capacity to feel pain. Pain produces stress in infants. It still produces stress in me too, as well. There seems to be a developmental progression in reactions to pain, and touch is one of the most highly developed sensory systems in newborns. Okay? Multimodal perception. That is when we often divide the five senses across. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But in fact, most of us use pretty much all of them all of the time and interconnectedly. So intermodal perception means that we combine these individual sensory inputs. Eventually, infants use the multimodal approach to perception, in which information is collected by various individual sensory systems in an integrated and coordinated sense. So, for example, you feed an infant, a 1-year infant, an orange, let's say, or something, maybe not an orange, but maybe a little smoothie. And they recognize that it's the color orange. They may not be able to identify it, but they see that color different from other colors. They taste it, they smell it, and they use those three senses to know what that substance is. That is, they use a multimodal approach to perception. Brain maturation leads to advances in these sensory systems. By preschool age, children gradually shift in how they view objects made of multiple parts. And there is an increased auditory acuity that develops right into preschool and childhood. Okay, so as you could tell from what we just covered, there is an incredible amount of growth and change due to brain maturation and interactions with the environment that helps the newborn, the infant, and the toddler to develop the five senses and use them concurrently to understand and interact with the world. It is also in childhood that we sometimes begin to realize that some children may have deficiencies or difficulties with perception. Visual impairments have both a legal and education meaning. So we see this with visual impairments. For example, younger and younger children are being given glasses to wear. I remember here we go again, when I was a young lad in the 1960s, and I was given a pair of glasses because I had visual impairments, which were discovered at the age of 5, right when typically these kinds of things start to be discovered. I was given a pair of glasses. I had surgery and then given a pair of glasses. I was the only child who had a pair of glasses at that age. Nowadays, you could see more and more younger children having glasses. That's because of better ability to identify visual impairments, as well as better advanced technologies in creating glasses for younger children. Anyway, visual impairment. It is legally defined as difficulties in seeing that may include blindness, less than 20/200 after correction, or partial sightedness, 20/70 after correction. Visual impairments can also include the inability to see up close and disabilities in color, depth, and light perception. Blindness is acuity below a 20/200 after correction. Now, auditory impairment is a special need that involves the loss of hearing or some aspect of hearing. This affects 1 to 2% of school-aged children and can vary across a number of dimensions. The loss may be limited to only certain frequencies. Loss in infancy is more severe than loss after the age of 3. Children who have little or no exposure to the sound of language are unable to understand or produce oral language themselves. Abstract thinking can also be affected. Auditory impairments are sometimes accompanied by speech impairments, speech that deviates so much from the speech of others that it calls attention to itself, interferes with communication, or produces maladjustments in the speaker. 3 to 5% of school-aged children have speech impairments. Stuttering, a substantial disruption in the rhythm and fluency of speech, is the most common speech impairment. So again, these kinds of difficulties with senses and perceptions begin to become more noticeable as children get older, particularly into preschool and early school ages. So what about the development of the senses and the sensory changes and difficulties that occur in adulthood? Well, you know what? Just like everything else, all 5 senses change through adulthood. Isn't that fun? Starting at age 40, approximately. Visual acuity, the ability to discern fine spatial detail in both close and distant objects, begins to decline on average for most people. The eye's lenses change shape and elasticity. The lenses become less transparent, which reduces the amount of light entering it. A nearly universal change in eyesight during middle adulthood is the loss of near vision, or presbyopia. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right. You might want to go to Google and listen to it being pronounced. There are declines also occur in depth perception, distance perception, the ability to view the world in 3 dimensions, and night vision in particular. Sometimes changes in vision are brought on by the disease called glaucoma, a condition where pressure in the fluid of the eye increases, either because the fluid cannot drain properly or because too much fluid is produced. About 1 to 2% of those over 40 are affected by glaucoma. African Americans are particularly susceptible to glaucoma. It can be treated if caught early enough. If left untreated, unfortunately, it can cause blindness. Hearing undergoes a gradual decline beginning in middle adulthood too, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture. The primary sort of loss is for sounds of high frequency, a problem called, oh my goodness, presbycusis. I don't know how to pronounce this. Go online and see how it's pronounced. About 12% of people between the ages of 45 and 65 suffer from this hearing loss. Men, as I said earlier, are more prone to hearing loss than women. Because the ears are not always equally affected by hearing loss, there can be sound localization, that is, the ability to detect the origin of sound is diminished. Some hearing loss results from environmental factors such as loud noises, or, and yes, my friends, listening to loud music earlier in one's life. The rest are caused by the aging process, by primary aging, which brings a loss of hair cells in the inner ear. Also, the eardrum becomes less elastic with primary aging. Reaction time in adulthood, not so slowing down. What that means is reaction time increases slightly in middle age, believe it or not. This is due to a gradual loss of muscle in the body and nervous system processing due to aging. People can compensate, however, by being more careful and practicing the skill. Exercise slows down this slowing down in reaction time and can actually improve reaction time. So sometimes middle-aged adults can improve their reaction time from what it was when they were younger adults. Vision. Lenses become less transparent and the pupils shrink. We've already talked about this. One thing I want to mention is cataracts, glaucoma. Let's see. So we've already talked about, the one thing I want to point out, I'm sorry, I almost missed this, is that driving at night becomes more challenging. This starts in middle adulthood and then continues to diminish. That is, night vision continues to diminish into older adulthood. One last thing I wanted to mention is hearing loss in late adulthood, which becomes a common problem. 30% of adults between the ages of 65 and 75 have some form of hearing loss. This is a very common part of primary aging process, which is interesting because if you think about it, aging is the most advanced, most developmentally advanced at birth. 50% of adults over 75 have hearing loss. High frequencies typically are that part of the sound spectrum that people lose their ability to hear. Hearing aids would be helpful 75% of the time, but only 20% of people who should wear them do wear them. Probably the reason for this is that hearing aids are imperfect. They amplify all sounds, so it is difficult to discern conversations because you hear everything equally. There is a stigma attached to wearing a hearing aid because people cannot hear. Some people withdraw from society, and because of this, they feel left alone, left out, and more socially isolated. Also, hearing loss may hasten cognitive declines in some elderly, which forces them to use considerable mental resources simply trying to understand what is being said. So just that process of trying to listen to what is being said can actually slow down cognitive processes and perception. One last thing is around taste and smell. Both of these senses become less discriminating in old age. Again, this is due to the decline in taste buds on the tongue, which is part of the primary aging process. I might add that people who smoke a great deal or who drink too much also can destroy taste buds in the tongue. So in that case, that would be a secondary aging process. Olfactory bulbs in the brain shrink and reduce the ability to smell. People eat less and they get poor nutrition. Older people may oversalt their food and therefore develop hypertension or high blood pressure. So these are some of the aging developments, sensorial, perceptual developments that occur in adulthood. That is our lecture for this week. Please feel free to listen to it, rewatch it again as needed. And thank you for watching this lecture.